Namaste everybody. Welcome to Citti Media, the Festival of Bharat. My name is Sharan Setty, your host. Today we have somebody who's been making the waves recently. He's almost everywhere on the internet, and his views on Afghanistan and India's history and civilization have been liked by many, and many are actually ascribing to it. And we were also very curious to hear from him about what he has to think about the developments in Afghanistan and India's civilizational links with it. Please join me in welcoming Abhijit Chavda ji. Abhijit ji, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure.
Absolutely, the pleasure is ours too. Just a small introduction about Abhijit ji for those of you who may not know him. He's a theoretical physicist by profession, a historian, a technologist, and also a writer. Now, that is a very, very diverse portfolio that you carry. First, if I may ask a personal question to you, how do you balance, especially since you are from a background of science, why take interest in history?
So I've always been interested in history as well. I have been a very curious person since my childhood. I've always liked history. I wanted to understand how the world works, what brought the world about, made the world the way it is today. So, and history would answer those questions. So that's why I've always been curious about history. And I've always followed history and geopolitics throughout my life.
Right. So going into the topic of Afghanistan that we are talking about today, a lot of shows that we have produced personally in the last 1 week or so, we've got experts on strategic affairs, military people, and political experts to discuss about various tangents of Afghanistan. But what very few people know is the historical ties that we've had with Afghanistan. That brings me to my first question. Now, in a recent video, you actually told that Pashtuns have some sort of an ancestry that's related to the greater India. Could you please tell how that is for our viewers?
Yes, so the Pashtuns are, if you look at the genetic studies that have been performed on the Pashtun populations, the Pashtuns are an extension of the greater northern Indian population. Genetically, they are very much the same as the people of northern India, whether it is Punjab, Haryana, Gujarat, Rajasthan, etc. If you look at their culture also, it's very similar. The Pashtun Attan dance, the national dance of the Pashtuns is called the Attan dance. It is almost exactly the same as the Gujarati Garba dance. Even the music sounds very similar. So there's clearly a great deal of affinity, and the genetics are the same. Now, if you look at the history of Afghanistan, it dates back to the Gandharan times, when the Mahabharat times, for instance, in which you had two very prominent characters, Gandhari and Shakudi, who were from Gandhar, which is present-day Afghanistan. And so it's always been part of India. It's always been part of the same population, culturally, historically, etc., genetically. Now, it all changed about 1,000 years ago with the Turkic invasions. But before that, it was all the same. Afghanistan was a Hindu-Buddhist region, part of India. When the Chinese traveler Xuanzang came to the region of Gandhar, he said, "I'm finally in India. I've crossed over into India." So that's how it's always been seen. And the people also there looked upon themselves as Indians only.
Right. And you were also speaking about the last king of Kabul who had Hindu heritage. Now, could you tell us about that?
So the last native Hindu kings of Kabul were the Kabul Shahis, I believe, who were supplanted, and the Ghoris also. The Ghoris initially, originally were Hindu Buddhist people. They were, and by the time they got converted to Islam, they were still Buddhists. And after the conversion, they started attacking India. Now, the last king of Kabul that I had referred to was Hemchandra Vikramaditya. So he was originally a general in the army of Sher Shah Suri, who was a Pashtun who was born in present-day Bihar. So Sher Shah Suri had conquered Delhi. He had evicted the Turkic invader Humayun, who had to run away to Persia. And Sher Shah Suri died within just 5 years because of some silly gunpowder accident. After that, it was Hemchandra Vikramaditya, his best general, most capable general, who became the king in his stead. He was the king of Kabul. He was also the king in Delhi. He was the last Hindu emperor of India. And his army was more than 99% Pashtuns and Muslims. And yet he was crowned the emperor in a Hindu ceremony in Delhi. So he was the last native Hindu emperor of India, of Delhi, and also of Kabul. And when he eventually lost that battle to Akbar, the invader Akbar, his head was cut off and it was sent to Kabul to be displayed to the people there, to terrorize them and tell them, see, this is what we did to your king. So he was the last native Hindu emperor of India and Afghanistan.
That's extremely interesting. I think, like you rightly said, in recent times, people are being more aware of our civilizational links with Afghanistan and even Pakistan. But that's about the modern day India, right? Now, if I have a small follow up for you, recently I saw this tweet on Twitter from one of the Pakistani handles, which was proudly talking about Takshashila being a part of their heritage. And and one of the comments said that my grandfather is older than Pakistan, so this kind of disproves whatever you're trying to say. So in that sense, of course, we acknowledge what history we've seen, but how much do the Afghans actually acknowledge our what we have to say about their history?
0%. Today's Pashtuns, today's Afghans do not see themselves as Indians. They would very much want to refute anything we are saying today. They would say that no, we are not Indians. We are the descendants of some lost Israeli tribe or something, lost Jewish tribe. They have invented all kinds of strange ancestries for themselves, which are not visible in any genetic study. It's like the Pakistanis. To initially they were trying to be Arabs. They would say we are all Arabs and all, but the Arabs did not like it at all, and they refuted that. So now the Pakistanis are trying to invent some Turkish ancestry for themselves. Pakistan, Turkey, bhai bhai. That sort of nonsense. So even so, whenever these people get converted, they try to invent new fictitious ancestries for themselves. So today, if you go to Afghanistan, they may have some warmth towards India because of the help India has given them, but they do not see themselves as Indian. Even if they know it, they will never acknowledge it.
A small follow up on that. It's very interesting what you just said. A lot of my friends are ethnic Hazaras and Uzbeks and Tajiks from Afghanistan, but they have more in commonality with Indians than the Pashtuns do. Why do you think Pashtuns themselves have been isolated in that sense with their connect to India?
So it's a very complex history of in the past 1,000 years. When the first Turkic invasion started happening into India, and Afghanistan was the westernmost, northernmost part of India, so it bore the brunt. It was the first to be converted. Afghanistan is the original Kashmir. What's happening in Kashmir today? Those sentiments were there 1,000 years ago. Now the Uzbeks, Hazaras, Tajiks, etc., are actually migrants into Afghanistan. The original people of Afghanistan are the Pashtuns. I don't know how much affinity the Uzbeks and the Hazaras would have towards India. The Uzbeks are Turks, ethnic Turks. The Hazaras are ethnic Mongols. They're the descendants of Genghis Khan's soldiers who were left behind. So it's a very complex situation, but I don't see any of them. See, the Uzbeks and Hazaras are genetically not very close to us. The Pashtuns are the same as the people of northern India, but they have been converted for 1,000 years, and their mentality and their attitudes are very in at some level it's very much anti-Hindu, anti-dharmic, anti-India. So it's a very complex scenario. It's very hard to unpack it in a very short period of time, but it's very complex, and there is a great deal of anti-Hindu sentiment there for sure.
Right. Absolutely. I completely agree with you. But if I have to ask one more follow up, especially given the geopolitics of today, after the Taliban has taken over of Kabul, we've seen how Pakistan has played a role in it. Now, the Haqqani network is also a major stakeholder in the entire process. And Pakistan, through Haqqani network, is trying to get a leverage over what happens in so-called strategic depth in Afghanistan, right? Now, if we look at the core of the Talibani ideology, it's still Pashtuni nationalism. And there had been demands for a separate Pashtun country, and the Taliban leaders have been very vocal about it, regardless of how close they are or they were to Pakistan. Now, because of the changing dynamics and because of Haqqani network being a part of it, how do you think this will play out, or will they come back to their old roots and there will be a fallout between Pakistan and the Taliban?
So you are absolutely right. The Pakistan recruited the Taliban from the madrasas in northern Pakistan, where you had all these Afghan refugees. So the Taliban are almost exclusively Pashtuns. The Taliban and the Pakistanis and the ISI have sought to mold an Islamist identity for the Taliban. But since they are all Pashtuns, they also have the Pashtun nationalist identity. And now that they have a country of their own, which they have always sought, these sentiments will come to the fore. As of today, it's a very complex, very rapidly evolving situation. We need to wait and watch. Many parties, many actors are trying to gain some sort of foothold and some sort of leverage over the Taliban. The ISI created them during the Benazir Bhutto's time. So definitely they have the tentacles inside the Taliban. But After all, the Taliban have their own country now. They have been able to capture the country without any significant help from the ISI or the Pakistanis. It happened almost overnight because the Americans handed over the country to them on a platter, essentially.
Right.
So because of that, the leverage that the Pakistanis sought to have has greatly diminished. Of course, the ISI is still involved. The ISI chief was in Kabul very recently overseeing the Panjshir operations. Like you said, the Haqqani network also has involvement with the Taliban and all, but the Taliban identify themselves as Pashtuns, as Afghan nationalists. They have their version of Sharia law that they want to impose on Afghanistan, which is definitely Islamist. But at the very core, the genesis of the Taliban goes back to the 1980s and the Mujahideen movement against the USSR occupation of Afghanistan. So it's always been about Pashtun and Afghan nationalism. And now that they have a country of their own, I see that in the next 10 years, because in geopolitics, the shortest period of time in which you can see genuine change is the decade. So I foresee over the next 10 years, there's going to be significant friction between the Taliban if they manage to establish themselves and the Pakistanis, because the Taliban, the Afghans have never recognized the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, the Durand line, which was brought about in 1893, I think. So that is going to come to the fore as time progresses, as they entrench themselves and consolidate their position.
Very, very interesting. So one term that is very commonly used is about Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires, right? Everybody keeps calling that. Now, especially with Pakistan coming into the picture, there's another player, the iron brother of Pakistan, China, who is already making plans. Now, of course, some experts say that you cannot quantify how much minerals is there, so it's too early. What are you guys doing and all of that? But China does have some concrete plans. They have ambitions, at least in terms of connectivity in the region. And already these experts are calling this a neo-colonization with China coming into the picture. How different will this be with China?
So when these people talk about Afghanistan being the graveyard of empires, it's always been Western empires that have lost, whether it's the British, whether it's the Russians, and now whether it's the Americans. It's always been the West that has lost. Afghanistan was Gandhar. It was taken over by the Turks. The Turks succeeded in doing whatever they wanted to do. So it's not always been a graveyard of empires, but when the West gets involved, it invariably loses. Now, the Chinese are not the West, they are the East. And the Chinese are not stupid, they learn from other people's mistakes. That is the best way of learning, learn from other people's mistakes. Right. Now, the Chinese want a number of things in Afghanistan. They want to use Afghanistan as a connecting point for their Belt and Road project. It would be great to have some infrastructure go through Afghanistan because it's very convenient. Of course, you have the minerals, the several trillion dollars worth of minerals, copper and lithium and whatnot. That's what they want. They also want to expand their geostrategic footprint in the region. They would want to always diversify their portfolio as far as these client states are concerned. And of course, they want to ensure there is no spillover of terrorism into Xinjiang, into the Uyghur territories, which China occupies, and where we know what they're doing to the Uyghur Muslims. So because of the Taliban's upsurge right now and victory, the Uyghurs may get a great deal of confidence from that. So that is also one of the factors that is at play over here. So the Chinese do want to get involved, and many people do believe that this may be a trap that the Americans have laid for the Chinese. They want to get them embroiled into Afghanistan, and maybe they want this to be China's Vietnam over a long period of time, that sort of thing. So as of today, it's very hard to say what's happening, because if you look at it day by day, week by week, it's very, the events are very rapid and they're quite random. But over time, we will get to see this. But there's clearly a bigger geopolitical game being played over here. Who are the actors? Definitely Pakistan is at some level an actor. The Chinese are involved. The Russians are involved. The Americans have deliberately left the country in this manner. And India is also, and India and Iran are also involved at certain levels. Now, to what extent the involvement will progress, we have to wait and watch. But I think that within this decade, India will definitely have some significant involvement in this region.
Right. Now that we've spoken about Pakistan and China, we have to address the question of India as well. And this is a two-folder. A, how does this affect India, especially with reference to Kashmir? And there is a lot of ambiguity in India's policy towards, I mean, there's not been anything formulated as of now. So according to you, what do you think India must do, and what are the steps, are the right measures?
So at this time, India needs to see. India has a great deal of investment in Afghanistan, more than $2 or $3 billion worth. Lots of agricultural projects. We have the dam and many other things. As of today, India needs to just sit back for some time, wait and watch and see the developments as they occur.
Right.
Are the Taliban a threat for Kashmir? I do not see them being a threat for Kashmir. The Taliban have only had one objective from the very beginning, which is to govern their country in the way they seek to govern it. They don't want external interference. The Taliban have never been involved in Kashmir. It was the Mujahideen who got involved in Kashmir after the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan. These were Arabs, these were all kinds of people. They were routed back into Kashmir by the Pakistanis, and India's government was very weak at the time. They allowed the entire situation to become a big conflagration. So I do not see the Taliban having any designs on Kashmir. They of course have this Islamist mindset, so they will have some sympathy etc for all Muslims in the Indian subcontinent, but all they want right now is to have their own country, to consolidate their hold over there, and therefore, and they have also said that they do not seek to have any interference. So there have been some conflicting statements coming out from the Taliban. My principle is very simple. Words don't matter, only actions matter. Words are simply negotiating positions. India and the Taliban are already in talks. We have already met with Mr. Sher Mohammad Stanikzai, who is one of their top leaders, who actually got some training in India in the 1970s, 80s, I think. So India has opened communication channels with the Taliban. I think that there will be no significant issue for India or Kashmir unless the Pakistanis themselves try to play some mischief. The Taliban, in my opinion, will not get involved in this.
Right. Thank you so much for that elaborate answer. Now, if we were to move back a little into our own history and connecting that with Afghanistan, Babur, when he was dying, he told that I don't want to be buried in the dusty plains of India and he wanted to be buried in the lush gardens of Kabul. And a lot of people take pride in this even today. And I was just going through some of the articles that were written about Babur and his death, and all of those versions sort of romanticized about how he really liked monsoon, and I was completely taken aback. So do we still have that hangover, should I say, where we romanticize unnecessary Islamic invasions? And why is this happening, and what's the solution?
It's all because of the deracination we are witnessing. It's all about because of the education system, which imposes certain thought processes, thought patterns, mental patterns, and attitudes on us, and it also imposes a certain ideology on us, which essentially kids get brainwashed into. So invaders are good, natives are bad, Hinduism bad, other things good. That sort of thing is hammered into children's minds from a very young age. And all you study about is Mughal history, Turco-Mughal history. And there's very little about our own resistance to the invasions and all that. So it portrays the past 1,000 years of humiliation as the greatest era in India's history, when so much came in from outside and we were essentially saved from our primitive state and all that. So it is the education system, it is the hangover of the Nehruvian regime that still persists in India. It is still continued forth by the current government, of course, and they have done nothing to change it. So that is the reason why we perceive all foreigners as superior to us and all that. Now, when it comes to Babur, he was an Uzbek. He came from the Fargana Valley. He was exiled from Fargana. He came to India and he managed to capture some territory. But I think when you are born somewhere far away, so a couple of thousand kilometers away, you're always going to be homesick for that place. And maybe that's the reason why he chose to be buried in Kabul. Of course, Kabul was part of India at the time. Afghanistan was part of India. It was not a foreign country the way it is today. So that may be one of the reasons why Babur sought to be buried in something that reminded him of his childhood home. That may be the reason, perhaps.
Right. I read your blog, And you were speaking about how Genghis Khan decided not to invade India, and you've given a lot of reasons behind that. It was a very interesting article. And today, if I were to draw parallels, and I don't know how much justice I'll actually do to this, but Hazaras feel the same way, especially because I was talking to a lot of friends of mine, and they see China and Pakistan as the same problem because they've sort of enabled these extremist forces, which have again enabled a genocide against ethnic minorities who are Muslims. So, is there a repetitive pattern in history occurring?
Yes, history occurs in cycles. You will always see. I mean, if you look at the history of the Turks and all that, they have always been extraordinarily cruel. They have always conducted genocides wherever they have gone. It doesn't matter if the people they are genociding are of their own religion. It doesn't matter. It has never mattered to them. It is always part of this particular, of the history of this particular let's say ideology or thought, or that's what it is. So history repeats in cycles. The Hazaras are all converted to Islam, and yet they are so much hated in Afghanistan for historical, for whatever reason it is, and they have been facing persecution and massacres and all kinds of oppression for as long as we can remember, right? So that's what happens. Afghanistan is a very fragmented country today because of so much foreign interference, and I don't see this ending. I mean, even the Taliban, I think they are quite anti-Hazara, anti-Shia because they are Sunnis. So I think they are going to stamp out certain ideologies or certain things in Afghanistan. I see that happening. So it is history is a cyclical, repetitive process. You see the same problems happening over and over again unless you address the root of the problem. So that's what it is.
Very interesting. So when the takeover happened, now of course there was a huge refugee crisis, right? You saw people falling off a C-17 aircraft, and the entire international community was in shock. And over the years, especially thanks to the post-Westphalian system that we have in India, Europe, and America, that minority rights and human rights have become a very important topic, and that is a very good thing. But we do see some sort of a double standard, because when the United States chooses to speak about, say, what is happening in Kashmir, allegedly, now that gets a lot of global attention. But India has been crying for decades that its own minorities, where they have nowhere to go. So we got in the CAA as well, and then there was a lot of opposition, and there still is today. So why? What do you think India can do to sort of protect its minorities in other Islamic nations like Afghanistan?
Well, this entire thing of minority rights and all that, it is just a convenient stick that the so-called international community, which is the Western world, uses to beat up other nations with. Look at the treatment of Native Americans in North America, whether it's the United States, whether it's Canada, all kinds of horrific discoveries are coming out. The way that children were massacred in the hundreds, even the thousands, in these Catholic boarding schools where they were forcibly sent after being separated from their parents. And even today, the natives of America, the true natives, the true citizens of North America, the Native Americans are so badly marginalized. They have to live on reservations where you get the worst of the situation conditions in the whole country. So they have no locus standi to talk about human rights, but because they control the media, they control all the global institutions like the UN, etc., they are able to go on doing it. So my point is very simple. India needs to stop crying and complaining. India's major problem is that India has bought into this Westphalian system. India has bought into this Western liberal democracy thing. I am not against democracy, but we had democracy way before Greece and everybody else. We had our own form of democracy. Democracy was born in India. We need to revert to our own civilizational processes and our own civilizational strengths. We need to stop being a third-rate knockoff copy of the West. That is what India is today. It is a cut price copy of the West, a very poor, mediocre imitation. India has its own rich culture and civilization. India needs to reject these failing ideas. Today, the West is imploding. This entire system doesn't work. See what's happening in the United States. There is no such thing as a country. People don't even love the country anymore. People are so much anti-US. They are trying to destroy the foundations of the American society of the past 200 years. The Western system is failing. India needs to wake up quickly. India needs to stop aspiring to be a knockoff, cheap copy of the West. India needs to revert to its roots and forget about what people say if they complain about human rights. I mean, these allegations are all false. There is no truth or veracity to the allegations of human rights abuses they make in India. Hindus don't oppress anybody. It is Hindus who are oppressed. So the first thing India needs to do is to set its own house in order. And only when that is achieved can we think about saving Indians or Hindus or etc. in other countries. First, clean up your own mess at home.
Absolutely. I mean, it's very interesting that you should say that, because I do have a small follow-up, if you will. You spoke about how India was democratic. Maybe the word wasn't there, but we did have our own systems of governance, like you said, and a lot of rights were ensured in that. Now, to a lot of our younger audience who are not aware about that, could you please give us a brief introduction to it?
So if you look at the system of governance during the Mahajanapada eras, during the Mahajanapada era, which is about 2,500 or thereabouts years before today, you had these republics. These are republics in which you had people who were elected, even kings. Even if you were a king, your duty was to serve the people, to serve the republic, and serve dharma. It was not to enrich yourself and become a very powerful oligarch kind of person. So you had democracy, you had people electing local representatives, and it was a democratic system in the dharmic sense. Even if you go back 5,000, 6,000 years to the Indus Valley, to the Harappan, to the Saraswati Sindhu civilization phase of our civilization, then you find that in all these enormous metropolitan settlements like Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Rakhigarhi, Bhirana, etc., Kalibangan, you will not see a single royal palace. You will not see any such thing. So you did not have royalty. The biggest and most prominent buildings are the public halls and the public baths and all that, which are all dedicated to the people. So this again demonstrates that there was no royalty. There was no such thing. It was all democratic. There must be some form of democracy. And what form it was, we need to look at our scriptures, because it is all delineated in there. So India is the birthplace of democracy. It was our own form of democracy. It was not the nonsense system that we have today. Every 4 years, some new fool comes into power who doesn't even know what he's saying at the end of the sentence. So we had our own system of democracy. That is what is not taught in our education system, because they don't want us to know how great our civilization once was.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. And even I think in Arthashastra, the concept of Janapada is very detailedly mentioned about how administration needs to happen across different sections of the society and things like that. But of course, that is perhaps a topic for another discussion. But speaking about Arthashastra and Chanakya, now you gave your comments on how Chanakya would probably deal with Afghanistan if he were president today. What can you tell us about that?
So Chanakya belonged to the realistic school of thought. He did not believe in idealism. He did not believe in putting ideology above the national interest. It was all about the national interest. He knew how the world works. The world is not a nice, pretty, happy place. The world is a very, it can be quite nasty. We know how things actually are. So how would Chanakya look at the situation? He would see that he would first ask himself, where does India's greatest threat come from? Is the Taliban a threat? No, so the Taliban are a ragtag bunch of terrorists in Gandhar, which is now cut off from India because of POK. But India's major threats are from China and from Pakistan. Pakistan is a Chinese proxy. Now, if India wants to have peace on its northern border, on its western border, India needs to find a solution for the China problem and the Pakistan problem. Now, which of these two problems is easier to solve? I would say is the Pakistan problem. Yes. So then Chanakya would say, what do I seek for Pakistan over the next 10 years? Well, Chanakya would want Pakistan to get fragmented over the next 10 years, hopefully peacefully. We don't believe in bloodshed, but well, that's the world. So hopefully we would want an independent Punjab, independent Balochistan, independent Sindh, and maybe Pashtunistan can revert back to Afghanistan, because the Afghans and even the Taliban do not recognize the Durand line, the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. So then the question is, how do you make this happen? Can we use the Taliban somehow? So this is the thing. See, the Taliban are an Islamist force. They have Sharia law, but so does Qatar, so does the UAE, so does Saudi Arabia. And India has excellent relations with these countries. So why can't India also have excellent relations with Afghanistan, whether the Taliban is in power or not? We
Right.
obviously cannot trust anybody, but we know what they want. We also want something, and there is clearly a sense of alignment, because we would like Pakistan to cease existing in the current form. We want the army to be the problem of the Pakistani army, which is holding an entire nation hostage. We need this problem to go away. So we can use, maybe we can work with the Taliban in certain areas. Maybe we can support their aspiration for having the Pashtunistan return to Afghanistan. So I would say that Vishnugupta Chanakya would look at the world in a very realistic manner.
Right.
It is, yeah, and he would definitely want to find or explore ways of working with the Taliban and possibly weaponizing them against Pakistan and even against China. So these are the avenues that Vishnugupta Chanakya would very much want to explore.
Very interesting, sir. Thank you so much for sharing that. And actually, when we are talking about balkanization of Pakistan, it's somehow been advocated time and again. And if we look at it with a very realist prism, it is happening in some sense because the same terror groups that Pakistan aims to empower for their own strategic benefits are the same ones which are biting them back, and that's happened time and again. Whether it's Northwestern Frontier Province, or Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, or even Balochistan, like you mentioned, for that matter, it's all even today fragmented. So, but if I were to ask you, do you think there is a timeline to this, and how soon do you think this is going to happen?
See, I would say that the 2020s are the big decade of change in the entire world. It's a decade of great geopolitical change. You have the virus going around. You have all kinds of geopolitical realignments happening. I would say India has 10 or 20 years at most in which to get its neighborhood in order,
Right.
if it doesn't want to be left behind in the big race of the 21st century. India has to progress on many fronts, but India needs to give itself a reasonable time frame in which to solve these problems. We cannot have this problem sitting on our borders forever. It needs to be resolved. I would say India needs to give itself a 10-year time frame in which to deal with the Pakistan problem and find a solution. The 2020s need to be that decade, and that is the decade in which the Taliban has emerged. We need to use that in some way to our advantage.
Right. So, but if I may ask you this, balkanization of these territories is alone not enough, right? Now, when we speak about, say, the British colonialism or the Greater China that China claims, and nobody knows what the concept is, they come up with maps every now and then. But when in India, you speak about the concept of Greater India and how we were connected to the Western civilization way long ago, and our trade was all over the world, and that Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and all of these countries were a part of the same civilization. Everybody sort of gets outraged. They think it's some sort of an extremist ideology. They think the RSS is the birther movement for the Akhand Bharat concept and all of that. So how do we normalize our geopolitical interests? Because speaking strictly in a sense of our strategic needs, what you said is a reality, and we actually need that. So how do we sort of convince the public and sort of tell them the actual versions of our history?
There is no need to convince any public. The public respects might. Might is always right. That's the way the world works. Look at all the atrocities various powerful countries do. Does anybody complain? The US invades Afghanistan. The US invades Nicaragua. The US invades anywhere they want. Does anyone complain? No, they do not, because the Americans are powerful enough. What India needs to do is, instead of trying to convince everybody, just become powerful and pursue your national interest, not by words, but by actions. Actions matter. Indians love to talk, 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 talk. There is a saying, if you want something to be said, ask the Indians. If you want something to be done, ask the Chinese. India needs to get out of this mindset of talking forever. India needs to start acting. It doesn't matter. See, anytime you pursue your national interest, there's going to be criticism because you are changing the status quo. Ignore the criticism, strengthen yourself, strengthen your economy, strengthen your armed forces, strengthen your nuclear arsenal, decolonize your population, and go forward. These are the directions India needs to take. We need to develop a thicker skin. There's always going to be criticism. There's always going to be Hindu phobia in the West and other places. Just ignore it, strengthen yourselves, and move forward.
Absolutely. I hope a lot of people take note of what you just have to say. And I know you're short on time, so let me come to the last question. Three intelligence chiefs from Russia, US, and the United States made a very surprise and a silent visit to India. But thanks to the press, it sort of got picked up. Now, India had been ignored from the entire discussion process, whether it's with the Russians or the Chinese inviting the Taliban to Beijing, or even the Doha process, right? We were just an invitee there. So why is there a sudden interest in India, and do you read anything from this visit?
So I see that if you look, see right now, this is the age of the big rivalry between the United States and the Chinese. Chinese are trying to overturn the world order, and they want to replace the United States in the next 10, 20 years as the only superpower in the world. And they
Yes.
feel that time has come. They feel the Americans are imploding, which they are to some sense, to some extent. So that is the situation we are in right now. The Americans see today India as the only country in Asia that can counterbalance China if things are taken in the correct direction. Now, so
Right.
that is the reason why the Americans keep visiting and they keep having these talks with India. Now, Russia, as of today, is very much in the anti-America camp. It is very much in the pro-China camp. China and Russia are almost like allies to some extent today. And yet, if you just take a look at the map, you see where there's a very big problem between China and Russia. They have such a long border that goes on for thousands of kilometers. The Chinese are getting more and more powerful. Obviously, they're going to be a threat to the Russians. The Russians and the Chinese almost went to war in the 1950s and 60s.
Yes.
It was the great disconnect between these two countries. The Russians almost nuked China, and there is a great deal of territorial heartburn because the Russians have taken over territory that the Chinese claim to be their own, and so forth. And
Right.
even today, as we speak right now, there are these ballistic missiles the Russians have pointed towards China at the border. Iskander M ballistic nuclear missiles pointed towards China. And I'm sure the Chinese have pointed missiles towards Russia. So they are not in any way real allies. It is a temporary alliance of convenience.
Right.
If and when the US problem is resolved, they're going to go at each other's throats. So the
Right.
Russians see the Chinese as a very big threat, long-term threat, not short-term. Short-term, there's cooperation. But even the Russians see India as the only nation in Asia that can be a genuine counterweight to China. So there are these things going on. I'm not privy to what conversations are happening, but there is clearly a geopolitical game afoot, and we are going to see the results of that in this coming decade.
Right. But how confident are you that the US will actually drift towards India? Because, of course, we've been hoping that ever since 2008, or even moving after, when the US has sort of realized that all the funding that was going towards Pakistan and everything that they tried to do with Pakistan has backfired. But even today, I don't think they've learned the lesson, because there's a lot of ambiguity of whether they want to be trusted allies with India or not.
See, allies can never be trusted. You can only see, how do you know what an ally wants? You have to examine what is their national interest. They will say all kinds of things to you. Ignore the words, look at their national interest. What are their pain points? What are the things they fear, and what are the things they desire? And that is their national interest. Today,
Right.
the Americans fear China. The Americans, their pain point is the expansion of China, this Belt and Road project and all that, all this infrastructure, the South China Sea claims. These are pain points for the Americans. Taiwan can be a very big pain point for America. And what do they desire? They desire to maintain the status quo in which they are the supreme, so the only hegemonic power in the world. So this is what they seek. This is what they desire. And does India fit in somewhere? Of course, India does fit in somewhere. It's not about trusting them. It's about knowing what they need. It is about anticipating how the world is going to go and what they will need in that situation. It's all about that. You cannot trust anybody in geopolitics. All alliances are temporary. India and Russia had a very long alliance for a very long time. But today we have drifted in different directions. So it's all about looking at the world decade by decade. In this decade, what's going to happen? What do I anticipate the world going in which direction? And who can we work with together, because our interests currently align and converge? That's the only thing we can do.
Right. Thank you so much, Abhijit ji, for joining us. It was a great session. I know we were supposed to focus only on Afghanistan, but I couldn't help but talk about everything else that's going on around the world because it's so interconnected at this point. And hopefully, with time, we'll get more clarity and we will also have you time and again on our show to discuss many more things.
Thank you so much for having me. Great pleasure.
Thank you so much, Abhijit ji. Have a nice day.
You too.
And to all our viewers, please do like, share, and subscribe. This is your host, Sharan Setty, signing off.
Namaste. We hope you enjoyed this Citti Media content. Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.